Last week I skipped putting my daughter to bed so I could finish editing a video. It wasn't a huge deal. My wife handled it. Everyone was fine. Nobody was traumatized. But I sat there afterward, footage still open on the screen, feeling like not so good about it. And that feeling's been building for a while now, honestly, longer than I want to admit. Because building this channel costs real hours. Hours I used to spend just playing or just being around, and now spend filming, scripting, editing, all of it. So today I want to actually talk about that. Not some clean answer about work-life balance, because I don't think I have one. Just an honest look at which hours I've traded, which ones I'd trade again, and which ones I genuinely regret. And you know, I've noticed I'm not the only one wrestling with this either. I've been reading through a lot of what other people are saying about this exact tension, work hard versus protect your time. And honestly, nobody seems to have a clean answer, which is kind of the whole reason I wanted to actually talk it through, instead of just repeating whatever take is loudest. Turns out this isn't even a new problem either. There's a Roman philosopher, Seneca, who wrote an entire essay on basically this exact thing almost 2,000 years ago. His actual argument was that life doesn't feel short because we don't have enough of it. It feels short because we waste huge chunks of it without ever noticing, which honestly reframed the whole guilt thing for me before I'd even finished reading it. If you go looking for advice on this, you basically get two answers, and they don't agree with each other at all. One camp says, just work. Grind now, sleep later. The sacrifice is temporary, and the payoff is permanent. So stop whining about missing a few nights. The other camp says the opposite. Protect your time, family first always. No amount of success is worth what you lose chasing it. Both of these are said with total confidence, like it's obvious, and both of them are missing something important. Neither one accounts for when you're actually starting. If you're 22, single, no kids, grinding 60 hours a week costs you almost nothing, you'll actually miss later. But if you're starting something at 34, married, 2 kids already in the picture, you don't have that same well of time to draw from. You're not choosing between grinding and comfort. You're choosing between this project and hours that were already spoken for. That's a completely different math, and almost nobody talks about it that way. The grind guys are usually talking to someone with almost nothing to lose yet. The balance guys are usually talking to someone who already has enough stability that protecting it isn't actually costing them a real opportunity. Neither one is really talking to the guy in the middle, the one who's got something to lose and something he still wants to build, at the same time with the same limited hours. So let me just be specific about what this actually takes, because I think people underestimate it badly. A single video isn't just the 20 minutes you watch. There's the research, the writing, usually a few passes before it's actually good. There's recording the gameplay, which takes as long as the gameplay takes, no shortcuts there. There's the actual voiceover, the editing, the thumbnail, the title testing, all of it stacked on top of a full-time job I already have. Realistically, one video eats somewhere between 8 and 12 hours of actual work, spread across a week that already had 0 spare hours in it to begin with. That time has to come from somewhere. It's not coming from sleep, because I tried that for a while, and it made me a genuinely worse version of myself to be around. So it comes out of the hours that used to be mine, or the hours that used to be ours as a family, and there's no version of this where that trade doesn't actually happen. You guys, I used to think editing would get faster the more I did it, and it has a little, but somehow I've just filled that saved time with more ambitious ideas instead of actually getting any of it back. Turns out getting better at something just means the bar for good enough moves right along with you. Some of you watching this are probably nodding along because you felt this exact thing with your own side project. Whatever it is, it's never actually finished costing you something. It just changes shape over time. And really quick, if any of this is resonating, please hit subscribe, genuinely helps, and I promise we're getting to something more useful than just me complaining. Back to it. Here's the part I don't think people say out loud enough. The guilt isn't really about the hours themselves. It's about the specific moments those hours replace. Missing a bedtime is one thing in the abstract, and a completely different thing when your kid asks where you were the next morning. There was a Saturday a few months back where I told my wife I just needed 2 more hours to finish an edit, and 2 hours turned into 4, and I missed a walk we'd actually planned as a family that day. Nobody yelled at me about it. That almost made it worse, honestly, because I had to sit with it myself instead of it just being resolved by someone being upset. I think a lot of guys go quiet about this specific feeling because admitting it makes the whole project feel selfish, and nobody wants to be the guy building something at his family's expense. But pretending the guilt isn't there doesn't make the trade-off go away. It just means you're making the trade without ever actually looking at it honestly. But I think that's actually more dangerous long-term than the guilt itself, because unexamined trade-offs are the ones that quietly pile up until one day you look back at a whole year and don't recognize where it went. At least the guilt is telling you something true, even when it's uncomfortable to hear. So here's where I actually want to push back on my own guilt a little, because I don't think all of this time is equally costly. There's a real difference between the hour I spent editing while my kids were already asleep and the hour I spent editing instead of being at the park with them. The first one isn't really a trade against my family at all. It's a trade against my own downtime, which is a completely different, much easier decision to make peace with. There's an old Stoic idea that's actually useful here from a guy named Epictetus. He drew this hard line between what's actually in your control and what isn't, and said most of our suffering comes from getting that line wrong. The guilt itself isn't really in your control. It just shows up whether you invited it or not. But which hour you actually spend and whether you planned it on purpose, that part is completely in your control. So that's actually the useful split, practically speaking. The second one is the real cost. And I think being honest with yourself means actually sorting your hours into those two piles instead of treating every working hour as equally guilty. Some of what I've traded, I'd trade again without thinking twice because it never actually touched my family time to begin with. Some of it I wouldn't, and knowing the difference is the only way I've found to actually carry this without it eating me alive. It's not about eliminating the guilt completely. It's about making sure the guilt is actually pointed at real costs, not at every single hour you spend building something. There's actually research on this exact pattern, and it surprised me when I first read it. Psychologists Gilovich and Medvec ran studies back in the 90s looking at what people regret, short-term versus looking back over an entire life. In the moment, we regret the things we did. Missing that walk, that's a real sharp regret right away. But looking back over years instead of days, the research found people tend to regret the things they never attempted far more than the actions they actually took. Later studies found the effect a bit weaker than the original, but the direction held up again and again. So the guilt I felt walking away from that edit was real, and I'm not dismissing it. But if the research is right, quitting this whole project to avoid feeling that guilt would very likely become the bigger regret, not the smaller one, 10 years from now. So if you're carrying this same weight right now over whatever you're building, I genuinely ask you to try that same sort before you assume the whole thing is unfair to the people around you. You might find most of the guilt is actually about a much smaller slice of hours than it feels like at 2 a.m. when you're being hardest on yourself. So practically, here's what's actually changed for me. Not as some perfect system, just what's genuinely helped. I batch filming now instead of grabbing gameplay whenever, so it eats one dedicated block instead of bleeding into random evenings unpredictably. I protect certain hours as completely off limits. No laptop, no exceptions. And I treat breaking that rule as a real failure, not just a minor slip. And I stopped pretending I can edit well after 9 at night because I can't. And pretending otherwise was just costing me sleep for genuinely worse output anyway. None of this makes the trade-off disappear. It just makes sure the trade-off is actually intentional instead of just whatever happened to get squeezed out by a deadline. That's honestly the whole difference from where I'm sitting. An intentional sacrifice you chose on purpose feels completely different than one that just happened to you because you didn't plan ahead. You know, my wife actually pointed this out to me before I ever put words to it myself. She said the difference wasn't really how much time I spent working, it was whether she could predict it. An unplanned 4-hour edit that eats into family time feels like a betrayal in a way that a scheduled Saturday morning block never does, even if the actual hours are identical. That distinction changed how I plan my whole week, honestly, more than any single productivity trick ever did. If you take one thing from this video and actually use it, honestly, make it that one. Predictability costs you almost nothing to build, and it buys back a huge amount of the guilt we've been talking about this whole time. One more thing on this, and it's honestly the one I wish I'd done earlier. Instead of just carrying all of it myself, I actually sat down with my wife and asked her directly what this was costing her, instead of just assuming I already knew and feeling guilty about my own guess. Some of what I thought was a big deal to her genuinely wasn't. Some of what I'd basically shrugged off turned out to matter a lot more than I realized. That conversation was uncomfortable, honestly, because it meant actually hearing specifics instead of just feeling generally bad in the abstract. But it was a lot more useful than the vague guilt I'd been sitting with on my own, because now I actually know which hours matter to protect, instead of guessing and getting it wrong in both directions. If you're building something and you've got a partner in the picture, that conversation is worth having directly, even though it's not a fun one. I'd genuinely rather you have it now than 6 months from now, after a bunch of assumptions have already quietly hardened into resentment on either side. I want to zoom out for a second, because I don't think this is actually a gaming problem or even really a YouTube problem. It's what happens to anyone building something real while their life is already full of things that matter. Maybe for you it's a business on the side, or going back to school, or training for something that eats your early mornings. The specific thing changes, but the actual math is the same math I've been describing this whole video. You're not choosing between sacrifice and comfort. You're choosing which specific hours get traded, and whether you're honest with yourself about which ones actually cost something real. I think that's the part actually worth taking away here, more than anything specific about my schedule. Not everyone's building a YouTube channel, but almost everyone I know is building something quietly on hours they didn't really have to spare. So I don't have a clean answer to wrap this up with, and I'm not going to pretend I do. The grind forever crowd and the balance first crowd are both right about something, and both wrong about plenty too. What I actually landed on is smaller than either of those answers. Sort your hours honestly. Some of what you're trading barely costs you anything real. Some of it costs you something you'll actually remember missing. I don't have this fully figured out, but I know which hours I'd trade again and which ones I wouldn't. That's the only honest place to start. Thanks for watching, you guys. I'll see you in the next one.